The Polish soldier, crouching in a shell hole on the slopes below the monastery of Monte Cassino, could see the ancient building silhouetted against the sky approximately 400 yards above his position, the massive stone walls appearing almost white in the moonlight on the night of May 17, 1944. Lieutenant Kazimierz Masłowski of the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division had been fighting his way up this mountain for 3 days, advancing yard by yard against German defenders who had turned every stone building, every pile of rubble, every crater into a defensive position from which machine guns and rifles fired on Polish troops attempting to advance up the steep slopes. Masłowski's uniform was caked with dirt and dried blood, some his own from a shrapnel wound on his left arm that he had bandaged hastily 3 hours earlier, and some from the soldier who had been killed beside him that afternoon when German mortar fire caught their squad crossing an exposed section of the slope where no cover existed except shallow depressions in the rocky ground. The monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict in 529 AD, and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries after being destroyed by earthquakes, by Saracen raiders in 883 AD, and by various armies fighting through the Liri Valley during medieval conflicts, dominated the landscape of central Italy from its position on a rocky peak, rising 1,700 feet above the valley floor. The building was enormous, covering several acres of the mountaintop with walls that in some places were 10 feet thick, constructed from massive stone blocks that had been quarried from the mountain itself and shaped by stonemasons whose work had endured for centuries. The monastery complex included a church with elaborate frescoes and mosaics, a library containing thousands of ancient manuscripts and books, cloisters where monks had walked for centuries in contemplation, and crypts containing the remains of saints and of nobles who had been buried in the monastery over the centuries. The monastery's strategic importance came not from any military value of the building itself, but from the mountain's position blocking the only practical route from southern Italy toward Rome, with Highway 6 running through the valley below the monastery and being completely dominated by whoever controlled the heights. German observers positioned on Monte Cassino could see every movement on Highway 6 for miles in both directions, could direct artillery fire onto any Allied vehicles or troop columns attempting to use the road, and could observe Allied positions in the valley, allowing German artillery to engage targets with accuracy that made movement during daylight extremely dangerous. The Liri Valley, stretching northwest from Cassino toward Rome, was the only route through the mountains that could accommodate the tanks, trucks, and artillery that modern armies required for mobile operations, making Cassino the key to any Allied advance toward the Italian capital. The German defensive positions in the mountains around Cassino were part of the Gustav line, the most formidable defensive system that German forces had constructed anywhere in Europe outside of the Atlantic Wall fortifications in France, stretching across the Italian peninsula from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic Sea, and anchored on key terrain features that allowed defenders to fire down on attackers attempting to advance through the valleys. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy from his headquarters near Rome, had selected the positions for the Gustav Line during autumn 1943, after Allied forces landed at Salerno and began advancing north from their beachheads, recognizing that the mountainous terrain of central Italy provided ideal conditions for defensive operations that would delay Allied advances and that would exact heavy casualties from Allied forces attempting to break through German positions. Kesselring had extensive experience in defensive warfare from the Eastern Front, where he had commanded air forces supporting German ground operations and where he had observed how Soviet forces attacked German defensive positions and what tactics worked in holding those positions against overwhelming numerical superiority. The lessons from the Eastern Front informed Kesselring's approach to defending Italy, with emphasis on creating defensive positions that exploited terrain advantages, on positioning forces in depth so that breakthrough of forward positions would not immediately expose rear areas to exploitation, and on maintaining mobile reserves that could counterattack Allied penetrations before they could be consolidated and expanded. The construction of the Gustav Line fortifications employed Italian civilian labor conscripted by German authorities, with thousands of workers spending months blasting positions into rock, constructing concrete bunkers, laying minefields, and stringing wire obstacles under supervision of German engineers who designed positions to maximize defensive effectiveness. The German 14th Army under General Fridolin von Sanger und Ederlin defended the western section of the Gustav Line, including Monte Cassino and the Liri Valley, deploying approximately 80,000 troops in positions that had been fortified over 6 months, with bunkers blasted into solid rock faces that provided protection from all but direct hits from the heaviest bombs or shells, trenches connecting defensive positions, allowing movement between positions without exposure to Allied observation or fire, minefields laid in patterns designed to channel attackers into prepared killing zones where German machine guns and artillery could engage mass targets, and wire obstacles strung in multiple belts across likely approach routes, with the wire being positioned to force attackers to slow down while crossing it and making them vulnerable to German fire for extended periods. General von Sanger was an unusual German officer, a Rhodes Scholar who spoke fluent English and who had studied at Oxford before World War I, a practicing Catholic who was troubled by Nazi ideology and who maintained some distance from the Nazi Party despite serving loyally in the Wehrmacht, and a professional soldier who understood defensive warfare as well as any commander in the German military. Sanger had commanded panzer divisions in North Africa and on the Eastern Front before being assigned to Italy in 1943, giving him experience in mobile operations that informed his understanding of how to defend against Allied forces that possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks and artillery. His defense of the Gustav Line would demonstrate mastery of defensive tactics and would inflict casualties on Allied forces that would make the Italian campaign one of the costliest theaters of the war, measured by casualties per mile of ground gained. The 1st Parachute Division under General Richard Heydrich held the Cassino sector, occupying positions on Monte Cassino itself and in the town of Cassino at the base of the mountain, with approximately 10,000 paratroopers who were among the best trained and most experienced troops in the German military. The paratroopers had not participated in airborne operations since Crete in 1941, where German airborne forces had suffered catastrophic casualties, capturing the island from British and Greek defenders, leading Hitler to forbid large-scale airborne operations for the remainder of the war. Instead, the parachute divisions were employed as elite infantry, fighting in North Africa, in Russia, and in Italy, where their training and esprit de corps made them formidable opponents in defensive operations, where determination and tactical skill could offset Allied numerical and material superiority. The Allied forces attacking the Gustav Line in early 1944 represented a multinational coalition including American, British, French, Polish, Indian, New Zealand, Canadian, South African, Brazilian, and other national contingents, totaling approximately 200,000 troops organized in the U.S. Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark Clark and the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery, who would soon be reassigned to command ground forces for the Normandy invasion. The coalition nature of Allied forces in Italy created both strengths and challenges, with the diversity of forces providing access to specialized capabilities, including French mountain troops and Indian units experienced in difficult terrain, but also creating coordination difficulties when units from different nations had different tactical doctrines, different equipment, and different languages that complicated communication during combat operations. The strategic objective driving Allied operations in Italy was complex and sometimes contradictory, with American commanders generally viewing the Italian campaign as a secondary theater that should be maintained with minimal forces, while primary effort was directed toward the invasion of France, while British commanders advocated for more aggressive operations in Italy that they argued would draw German forces away from other theaters and that might provide opportunities for Allied advances into the Balkans or toward Austria. The compromise that emerged from these competing visions was to continue operations in Italy with objectives of tying down German forces, of capturing Rome for its propaganda value, and of advancing as far north as possible while preparing for the Normandy invasion that was scheduled for spring 1944. The First Battle of Monte Cassino began on January 17, 1944, when units of the U.S. II Corps under Major General Jeffrey Keyes attacked across the Rapido River, attempting to establish bridgeheads from which they could advance into the Liri Valley and outflank German positions on Monte Cassino by driving northwest along the valley floor toward Highway 6, which ran through the German rear areas. The 36th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Fred Walker, a Texas National Guard division that had been federalized in 1940, and that had fought in North Africa and at Salerno, but that had never conducted a major river crossing under fire, was assigned to cross the Rapido River at Sant'Angelo and to establish bridgeheads on the western bank, despite reconnaissance reports suggesting that German defenses on the far bank were formidable and that crossing sites were covered by German artillery and machine guns firing from prepared positions on heights overlooking the river. General Walker had protested the orders to attack across the Rapido, writing in his diary that the operation was poorly planned and that casualties would be extremely heavy, but he was overruled by Corps and Army commanders who believed that the attack was necessary to support the upcoming Anzio landings by drawing German reserves toward Cassino and away from the beaches where the Anzio force would land. The planning for the Rapido crossing was conducted hastily with inadequate time for reconnaissance, with insufficient assault boats and bridging equipment allocated to the division, and with artillery support that was inadequate for suppressing German defensive positions that dominated the crossing sites. The assault crossings of the Rapido River on the night of January 20th, 21st became a catastrophe for the 36th Division, with assault boats being destroyed by German artillery and machine gun fire as engineers attempted to carry them across muddy fields to the river, with the boats that reached the water being hit by German fire as they attempted to cross the swift current, and with engineers attempting to construct footbridges being killed before completing their work, leaving infantry who had crossed in assault boats isolated on the far bank without heavy weapons or reinforcements. The few infantry companies that successfully established positions on the western bank, perhaps 500 to 600 men from an assault force of several thousand, found themselves trapped against the river with German positions on higher ground, firing down on them, with German counterattacks being launched to eliminate the bridgeheads before they could be reinforced, and with no possibility of retreat across the river because the footbridges had been destroyed and because attempting to swim back across under fire would be suicidal. Captain John Stovall, commanding Company E of the 141st Infantry Regiment, was among the officers who successfully led their men across the Rapido during the initial assault, his company crossing in assault boats around midnight on January 20th and establishing a position approximately 200 yards from the western bank where they took cover in irrigation ditches and began attempting to dig foxholes in the rocky soil. Stovall's company numbered approximately 120 men before the crossing, but casualties during the crossing had reduced strength to perhaps 80 men who had made it across the river with their personal weapons and a few machine guns, but without mortars, without anti-tank weapons, and without communications equipment that had been lost when the boat carrying the radio was hit by German fire and sank. The German artillery fire that began falling on Company E's position around 0100 hours on January 21st was devastatingly accurate, with shells landing directly in the irrigation ditches where Stovall's men were sheltering and causing casualties from direct hits and from shrapnel that ricocheted off the rocky ground. Stovall attempted to move his company to better positions, but found that any movement drew immediate German machine gun fire from positions on higher ground that had excellent observation of the bridgehead area. The wounded men screaming for medics could not be treated properly because medical supplies were limited to what individual soldiers carried in their first aid kits, and because the company medics attempting to treat wounded were themselves being hit by German fire that made no distinction between combat troops and medical personnel. The German counterattack against Company E's position began around 300 hours when German infantry supported by tanks advanced toward the bridgehead from positions approximately 500 yards inland. Stovall could hear the tanks before he could see them, the sound of engines and of tracks on pavement carrying clearly in the still night air and creating fear among his men who understood that they had no weapons that could stop armor. The German infantry advancing with the tanks fired flares that illuminated the bridgehead area in harsh white light that turned night into day, and that revealed Company E's positions to the German machine gunners, who opened fire from ranges of perhaps 200 yards, where their fire was accurate and where Stovall's men attempting to return fire were clearly visible. The defense of the bridgehead lasted approximately 2 hours before being overwhelmed, with Company E and other units that had crossed being systematically destroyed by German attacks that exploited the isolated bridgehead's lack of heavy weapons and inability to receive reinforcements. Captain Stovall was killed around 0500 hours when a German shell made a direct hit on his position, and with his death and with the deaths of other officers and NCOs, the company's resistance collapsed as individual soldiers attempted to escape back across the river or surrendered when Germans overran their positions. Of the approximately 80 men from Company E who had successfully crossed the Rapido, fewer than 20 made it back across the river, with the remainder being killed or captured in the bridgehead or drowning while attempting to swim back across the swift current. The 36th Division's total casualties during the Rapido crossing operations on January 20th, 21st exceeded 1,700 men killed, wounded, or missing, representing approximately 40% casualties for the units that had been committed to the attack and achieving no objectives except demonstrating that German defensive positions were far stronger than Allied intelligence had assessed. The bitter recriminations following the battle saw General Walker and other officers blaming higher headquarters for ordering an attack that had no reasonable prospect of success, while Corps and Army commanders defended the operation as necessary despite its failure and despite the casualties. A congressional investigation after the war examined the Rapido crossing and concluded that the operation had been poorly planned and executed, vindicating Walker's protests and creating lasting controversy about the decision-making that led to the disaster. The French Expeditionary Corps under General Alphonse Juin attacked simultaneously with the American Rapido operation advancing through mountains north of Cassino, attempting to outflank German positions by moving through terrain that German planners had assumed was too difficult for large-scale attacks. General Juin commanded approximately 70,000 troops, including units recruited from North Africa, primarily Morocco and Algeria, that included colonial infantry regiments and Gumir units who were irregular mountain fighters experienced in operating in difficult terrain with minimal logistic support. The Gumirs, Berber tribesmen from the Atlas Mountains who served in French colonial forces, wore distinctive striped djellabas and operated in small independent groups that could move through mountain terrain that was impassable for conventional infantry units burdened with heavy equipment and dependent on supply lines. The French attacks beginning on January 12th achieved significant initial success, advancing several miles through the mountains north of Cassino and reaching positions that threatened German supply routes running through the mountains toward the Cassino sector. The Gumiers operated primarily at night, infiltrating through German positions and attacking German supply columns and isolated outposts with tactics that created fear among German troops who were accustomed to more conventional forms of warfare and who found the Gumiers' approach to combat unsettling. The French advance continued through mid-January with forces reaching Monte Cefalco and other heights that provided observation over German rear areas, but the advance stalled when German reinforcements were rushed from other sectors and when winter weather made resupply of French forces advancing through roadless mountains increasingly difficult. The winter weather in the mountains around Cassino during January 1944 was among the worst in decades, with heavy snow, freezing rain, and temperatures well below freezing, creating conditions that were as dangerous to troops as enemy fire. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite and from exposure-related injuries, with Allied forces being particularly vulnerable because their positions in the mountains often lacked overhead cover, and because supply difficulties meant that warm food and adequate clothing were not always available to frontline units. The German defenders had advantage of fighting from prepared positions that included bunkers with heating and that had stockpiled supplies, giving them better protection from weather than Allied forces attacking through exposed terrain. The bombing of Monte Cassino Monastery on February 15, 1944, represented one of the most controversial decisions of the entire Italian campaign, destroying a building of immense cultural and religious significance based on mistaken beliefs that German forces were using the monastery as an observation post and defensive position. The decision to bomb was made by Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand Corps that was preparing to attack Cassino, who believed, based on intelligence reports and on his own analysis, that German observers in the monastery were directing artillery fire on Allied positions and that the building needed to be destroyed before ground attacks could succeed with acceptable casualties. The intelligence suggesting German occupation of the monastery came from multiple sources, including reports from Italian civilians who claimed to have seen German soldiers in the building, from aerial reconnaissance photographs that some analysts interpreted as showing German activity in the monastery, and from intercepts of German radio traffic that mentioned the monastery, though without clearly indicating whether Germans were actually occupying the building or simply using it as a reference point for navigation and fire direction. General Mark Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army that included the New Zealand Corps, opposed the bombing on multiple grounds, including the cultural and religious significance of the monastery, which had been protected by mutual agreement between belligerents in previous conflicts, the questionable military necessity given that intelligence about German occupation was not conclusive, and the tactical consideration that destroying the monastery would create rubble that would actually provide better defensive positions than the intact building would offer. Clark's opposition was supported by some of his subordinate commanders and by some intelligence officers who argued that German forces were not occupying the monastery, and that bombing it would be both morally wrong and tactically counterproductive. But Freiburg insisted that the bombing was militarily necessary, arguing that New Zealand forces could not be asked to attack Cassino, while German observers in the monastery could direct fire on them with impunity and threatening to refuse to attack if the monastery was not destroyed. The political dimensions of Freiburg's threat were significant because New Zealand was providing substantial forces to the Italian campaign, and because the New Zealand government had made clear that it would not tolerate unnecessary casualties resulting from inadequate support for New Zealand troops. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, concluded that the political and military considerations of maintaining New Zealand's support for the campaign outweighed the arguments against bombing, and he authorized the operation despite Clark's objections and despite warnings from cultural affairs officers about the monastery's significance. The warning that was delivered to the monastery before the bombing, dropped in leaflets by aircraft on February 14th, gave occupants approximately 24 hours to evacuate before the bombing would commence. The abbot of Monte Cassino, Bishop Gregorio Diamare, had maintained throughout the months of fighting around the monastery that German forces were not occupying the building and that the monastery was being used only to shelter Italian civilian refugees who had fled from fighting in surrounding areas. Approximately 1,400 civilians were sheltering in the monastery when the warning leaflets were dropped, including elderly people, women, and children who had nowhere else to go and who believed that the monastery's religious status would protect them from the fighting. The evacuation that followed the warning was chaotic and incomplete, with some civilians leaving the monastery and attempting to reach Allied lines while others remained believing that the warning was a bluff or that the monastery would not actually be bombed because of its religious significance. The German forces in the area around the monastery did not enter the building before the bombing, respecting an agreement with the abbot that the monastery would remain neutral ground not occupied by either side, though German defensive positions were located within a few hundred yards of the monastery walls, and German soldiers occasionally visited the monastery to obtain water or to seek medical treatment for wounded. The bombing was conducted by approximately 250 American heavy bombers, including B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, and by medium bombers including B-25 Mitchells and B-26 Marauders that dropped approximately 600 tons of bombs on the monastery during the morning of February 15th in multiple waves over approximately 4 hours. The bombers approached the target from different directions and different altitudes, with some attacking from 20,000 feet and others from much lower altitudes where accuracy was better, but where vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire was greater. The bombs included 1,000-pound and 500-pound high-explosive bombs that were designed to destroy buildings and fortifications, and incendiary bombs that were intended to set fires that would consume anything that survived the high-explosive bombs. The effects of the bombing on the monastery were catastrophic, with direct hits collapsing walls and destroying entire sections of the building, including the church where many civilians were sheltering, believing that the sacred character of the space would protect them. The Italian civilians who had remained in the monastery were killed in the bombing, with approximately 230 dying when bombs destroyed the sections where they were sheltering or when falling debris crushed them. The abbot survived the bombing by sheltering in the monastery's crypts, which were partially protected by being underground, emerging after the bombing to find the monastery that he had led for years reduced to ruins, and hundreds of people under his protection dead. The strategic impact of the bombing was opposite to what was intended, with German forces immediately occupying the ruins after the bombing and recognizing that the destroyed monastery provided excellent defensive positions with fields of fire that the intact building had not offered. The rubble created by the bombing included massive stone blocks from collapsed walls that could not be moved and that provided protection from Allied fire better than any fortifications German engineers could have constructed, natural caves and voids in the rubble that could serve as fighting positions, and multiple levels of debris that allowed German defenders to establish positions in depth where Allied forces clearing one level would discover Germans fighting from another level beneath or above. General Heydrich, commanding the 1st Parachute Division, understood immediately that the ruins provided better defensive positions than he had previously possessed, and moved units into the destroyed monastery within hours of the bombing, establishing machine gun positions among the rubble and positioning observers who could see Allied positions throughout the valley. The paratroopers occupying the ruins brought supplies including ammunition, water, and rations, created living spaces in the crypts and in voids among the rubble, and prepared defensive positions that would resist Allied attacks for 3 more months, despite continuous bombardment and repeated infantry assaults. The ground attack that followed the bombing on February 16th-18th saw the 4th Indian Division under Major General Francis Tucker attacking toward the monastery from the north, attempting to advance across approximately 1,500 yards of mountainous terrain that rose steeply toward the monastery ruins, while New Zealand infantry under Freiberg attacked through the town of Cassino, attempting to advance up the mountain from the south. The Indian attacks employed units including the Essex Regiment, the Royal Sussex Regiment, and Gurkha battalions that were experienced in mountain warfare and that had fought in North Africa and in earlier Italian campaigns. But the attacks made minimal progress against German positions that had not been significantly affected by the bombing, and that occupied positions allowing them to fire down on Indian infantry advancing up the slopes. The Gurkha battalion, attacking toward Point 593, a height approximately 500 yards northeast of the monastery that dominated approaches from that direction, advanced to within 50 yards of the crest before being stopped by German fire from positions that had survived the preliminary bombardment. The Gurkhas fought with characteristic courage and determination, using kukris in hand-to-hand combat when they reached German positions, but they lacked the numbers and the supporting fires needed to hold positions they briefly captured when German counterattacks were launched. The battalion suffered approximately 50% casualties during 2 days of fighting without achieving its objective, demonstrating the difficulty of attacking prepared German positions even when attackers possessed superior training and motivation. The New Zealand attacks through Casino Town became bogged down in rubble-choked streets where German defenders had established positions in destroyed buildings, and where every intersection and every pile of debris became a fortified position that had to be captured through close-quarters combat. The New Zealand infantry, supported by tanks, found that armor was nearly useless in the confined spaces of the destroyed town, with tanks being unable to maneuver through rubble-block streets and being vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons firing from concealed positions at ranges of perhaps 50 yards, where even light anti-tank weapons could penetrate tank armor. The fighting in Casino Town during mid-February demonstrated patterns that would characterize the subsequent battles, with attacks achieving limited gains at heavy cost and with German defenders contesting every yard of ground. The second major attack on Cassino began on March 15th with another massive bombing operation, this time targeting the town of Cassino rather than the monastery, with approximately 775 aircraft, including heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers, dropping approximately 1,400 tons of bombs on the small town in an attempt to destroy German defensive positions and to create conditions that would allow New Zealand infantry to advance through the ruins without facing the intense defensive fire that had stopped previous attacks. The bombing was the heaviest aerial attack delivered in direct support of ground forces up to that point in the war, exceeding the tonnage dropped on many German cities during strategic bombing operations and creating levels of destruction that obliterated much of the town. The bombing began at 0830 hours on March 15th with heavy bombers attacking from high altitude, dropping bombs that destroyed buildings throughout the town and created enormous craters in streets and in open areas. The medium bombers followed, attacking from lower altitudes where accuracy was better, targeting specific buildings that intelligence had identified as German strongpoints. The fighter bombers attacked last, strafing German positions with machine gun and cannon fire and dropping smaller bombs on targets that survived the earlier attacks. The bombing continued for approximately 4 hours, during which time the town of Cassino was effectively destroyed, with few buildings remaining intact, and with the landscape being transformed into a moonscape of craters and rubble. The artillery bombardment that followed the air attacks employed approximately 750 guns, ranging from 25-pounder field guns to 8-inch howitzers, firing approximately 200,000 shells during the hours following the air attack and creating additional destruction in areas that the bombing had not completely obliterated. The artillery fires were carefully coordinated with planned infantry attacks, with fires being concentrated on specific areas that the New Zealand infantry would have to cross, and with fires being lifted according to a strict timetable that was supposed to allow infantry to advance close behind the barrage without giving German defenders time to recover and man positions before infantry arrived. But the destruction was so complete that it created obstacles rather than opportunities, with streets being blocked by rubble that tanks could not cross and that infantry could navigate only slowly while climbing over debris and through destroyed buildings, with craters being so large and so numerous that crossing the town required descending into craters and climbing out the far side repeatedly while being exposed to German fire from surrounding positions, and with dust and smoke from the bombing and shelling reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards, and making navigation through the destroyed town extremely difficult. The New Zealand infantry and tanks advancing into Cassino after the bombing found that the destruction had made their task more difficult rather than easier, with Lieutenant Colonel Howard Kippenberger commanding the 4th New Zealand Brigade, reporting that the rubble made movement nearly impossible, and that German defenders were emerging from shelters that had survived the bombing to occupy positions in the ruins from which they could fire on New Zealand troops attempting to advance. The German paratroopers defending Cassino had sheltered in deep cellars and in bunkers that were protected by multiple layers of rubble and reinforced concrete, emerging after the bombardment ended to find their town destroyed, but their fighting positions among the ruins being better than the positions they had occupied before the bombing. The fighting in Cassino during March 16, 23rd became a brutal close-quarters battle where infantry fought building to building and room to room when buildings still had recognizable rooms, where tanks attempting to support infantry were destroyed by German anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions among the rubble, and where casualties mounted without corresponding gains in territory captured. The New Zealand infantry made some progress during the first days of fighting, capturing several blocks of the town and establishing positions from which they could observe German positions in other parts of the town. But each advance brought them under fire from new German positions that had not been visible from their previous locations, and that subjected advancing troops to machine gun and rifle fire from multiple directions. The fighting for Castle Hill, a rocky prominence overlooking Casino Town from the northwest, where a medieval castle had stood before being destroyed in the fighting, became particularly intense as New Zealand and Indian troops attempted to capture positions that would provide observation over the entire town, and that would allow them to direct artillery fire on German positions. The attacks on Castle Hill involved climbing steep rocky slopes under fire from German positions above, crossing areas that were completely exposed to German observation where any movement drew immediate fire, and assaulting German positions that were protected by the natural fortifications of the rocky terrain and by obstacles that Germans had prepared. Sergeant Jack Hinton of the New Zealand Division, a veteran who had won the Victoria Cross for actions in Greece in 1941, and who had survived wounds in captivity before being repatriated and returning to combat, participated in the attacks on Castle Hill during March 1944, leading his platoon up the rocky slopes toward German positions approximately 200 yards above their starting positions. Hinton's experience in previous battles had taught him how to read terrain and how to identify covered routes that might allow movement without being constantly exposed to fire. But the slopes of Castle Hill offered minimal cover with the rocky ground, providing no opportunity to dig foxholes, and with the sparse vegetation providing concealment only from distant observation. The advance up Castle Hill required moving in short rushes between rock outcroppings that provided brief cover, with Hinton's platoon taking casualties from German fire each time they moved across exposed ground. The German machine gun positions firing from higher elevations had perfect fields of fire covering all approaches, with the German gunners being able to see New Zealand soldiers attempting to advance and being able to engage them with accurate fire that forced constant use of cover and that made rapid advances impossible. Hinton's platoon suffered approximately 30% casualties, reaching a position approximately 100 yards from the summit, where they took cover among rocks and attempted to suppress German positions with rifle fire, while waiting for artillery support that would allow them to continue advancing. The artillery support that Hinton requested was delivered by New Zealand 25-pounder guns firing from positions in the valley, with shells landing on the crest of Castle Hill and creating explosions that temporarily suppressed German fire. Hinton led his platoon forward during the bombardment, reaching positions approximately 50 yards from the summit before the artillery fire lifted, and German defenders who had sheltered during the bombardment emerged and opened fire on the advancing New Zealanders. The final assault required crossing completely exposed ground while under fire from multiple German positions, with Hinton being wounded for the second time in the war when a German bullet struck his shoulder, but continuing to advance and reaching German positions where hand-to-hand fighting with grenades and bayonets determined the outcome. The New Zealand capture of some German positions on Castle Hill during March 17th-18th represented one of the few tactical successes during the Second Battle of Cassino, with New Zealand troops holding positions they had captured despite German counterattacks and despite continuous German artillery fire that caused casualties and that made resupply of the positions difficult. But the overall attack had clearly failed by March 23rd, despite the enormous expenditure of bombs and shells, and despite the casualties that New Zealand and Indian forces had suffered, leading General Freyberg to conclude that continuing attacks would only result in additional casualties without achieving objectives, and to recommend suspending operations until weather improved and until a new plan could be developed. The recommendation to suspend operations was accepted by General Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, who recognized that continuing frontal attacks on Cassino with the forces and methods that had failed in January, February, and March would not suddenly succeed in April, and that a fundamentally different approach was needed. The planning for what would become the fourth and final Battle of Cassino began in late March 1944, when Alexander and his staff began developing plans for a broader offensive that would attack across the entire Gustav line, rather than concentrating on Cassino alone, creating multiple threats that would prevent Germans from concentrating reserves and that would force them to defend extended positions with forces that were insufficient for such extended defense. The plan, designated Operation Diadem, called for simultaneous attacks by British 8th Army in the Liri Valley, French Expeditionary Corps through mountains southwest of Cassino, Polish the Senun Corps against Monte Cassino itself, and American forces along the coast and at Anzio, with all attacks being coordinated to begin on the same date, and with all forces being reinforced to levels that would provide overwhelming superiority over German defenders. The forces assembled for Diadem exceeded 200,000 troops, supported by approximately 2,000 artillery pieces, and with air superiority that would allow continuous air attacks on German positions and supply lines without German Air Force being able to interfere effectively. The German forces defending the Gustav line in May 1944 had been reinforced compared to strength available during earlier battles, with General Senger commanding approximately 80,000 troops in the western section of the Gustav line, including the Cassino sector. The 1st Parachute Division still held Monte Cassino despite casualties suffered during previous battles, with replacements having been sent from Germany to restore the division to reasonable strength, though the new troops lacked the experience and training of the veterans who had been killed or evacuated due to wounds. The German defensive strategy was to hold the Gustav line as long as possible to delay Allied advance toward Rome, to inflict maximum casualties on attacking Allied forces, making them cautious about future offensive operations, and to withdraw in organized fashion to the next defensive line when positions became untenable. Operation Diadem began on the night of May 11–12, 1944, with artillery bombardment commencing at 2300 hours across the entire front from the coast to the mountains, with approximately 1600 Allied guns opening fire simultaneously and delivering concentrations of fire that exceeded anything previously achieved in the Italian campaign. The artillery fires were carefully coordinated with planned infantry attacks, with fires lifting from forward German positions according to strict timetables that were designed to allow Allied infantry to assault immediately after fires lifted, reaching German positions before defenders could recover from the bombardment and man weapons. The bombardment continued through the night with varying intensity, sometimes concentrating on specific areas where attacks were imminent, and sometimes spreading across wider areas to prevent Germans from identifying where main attacks would occur. The French Expeditionary Corps attacks through the mountains beginning on May 12th achieved the most dramatic initial success of Operation Diadem, with Moroccan mountain troops and Goumiers advancing through terrain that German planners continued to believe was largely impassable, and that was therefore only lightly defended compared to the valleys where Germans expected main Allied efforts. General Juin's forces advanced rapidly during May 12–14, penetrating approximately 15 miles through the mountains in 3 days, and reaching positions that threatened Highway 82, which was a major German supply route running parallel to the Gustav line and supporting German forces defending Cassino and the Liri Valley. The French advance achieved surprise because German intelligence had not detected the concentration of French forces in the mountains, believing that French forces would attack in the valleys where terrain favored the use of armor and where conventional infantry operations could be supported by artillery. The French use of goumiers and of colonial mountain troops, trained specifically for operating in difficult terrain, allowed them to move through areas where German forces had positioned only small outposts, achieving penetrations before German reserves could be shifted to threatened areas. The goumiers operated with minimal supplies, carrying what they needed on pack animals and living partly off captured German supplies, allowing them to sustain operations far from roads and from conventional supply routes. The British Eighth Army attacks in the Liri Valley made slower progress against strong German resistance, with initial assaults crossing the Rapido River at points where the January attacks had failed and establishing bridgeheads despite German defensive fires. The British forces employed approximately 1,000 tanks in the Liri Valley attacks, creating armored concentrations that overwhelmed German anti-tank defenses once bridgeheads were expanded sufficiently to allow tanks to cross the river and to deploy in the valley beyond. The German forces defending the Liri Valley fought stubbornly, counterattacking British bridgeheads and inflicting casualties on British infantry. But the sheer weight of British attacks and the continuous artillery support that British forces could call upon gradually wore down German resistance. The Polish Two-Corps attacks on Monte Cassino beginning on the night of May 11-12 represented the culmination of months of Polish preparation and training for the specific mission of capturing the heights that had resisted all previous Allied attacks. General Anders, commanding the Polish Two-Corps, had approximately 50,000 troops organized in two infantry divisions, the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division and the 5th Kresowa Infantry Division, with both divisions including veterans who had fought in Poland in 1939, who had endured Soviet captivity after the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland, who had been released when Germany invaded Soviet Union in 1941, and who had made their way through Soviet Union and Iran to reach the Middle East, where Polish forces were being organized under British command. The Polish soldiers fighting at Cassino understood that they were representing Poland in battle at a time when their homeland was still occupied, when Polish political future was uncertain with Soviet forces advancing westward across Poland, and when Poland's Western allies were making decisions about post-war arrangements without meaningful Polish input. The opportunity to fight at Cassino, to contribute to Allied victory, and to demonstrate Polish military capabilities was therefore not just a military operation, but a political statement about Poland's right to be treated as a significant Allied partner whose interests deserved consideration when post-war arrangements were being made. The initial Polish attacks on Monte Cassino on May 12th encountered strong German resistance from paratroopers who had survived the preliminary bombardment and who were determined to hold positions they had defended successfully against British, American, New Zealand, and Indian forces during 4 months of fighting. The Polish infantry advancing up the slopes toward the monastery moved through minefields where engineers cleared paths using mine detectors and prodding with bayonets, with the clearing operations being conducted under fire from German positions on higher ground that could observe the Polish advance and that could direct fire on the engineers attempting to clear safe routes. Private Władysław Nowak of the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division advanced with the first assault wave on May 12th, carrying a rifle and basic combat equipment weighing approximately 40 pounds, plus additional ammunition and grenades that brought his total load to perhaps 60 pounds of equipment that had to be carried up steep mountain slopes while under fire. Nowak had been a farm worker in eastern Poland before the war, living a peaceful life tending crops and livestock until September 1939, when both Germany and Soviet Union invaded Poland, and his life changed completely. He had been captured by Soviet forces and sent to a labor camp in Siberia, where he spent 2 years in conditions that killed many of his fellow prisoners before being released when Germany invaded Soviet Union. The advance up the slopes toward German positions required Nowak to move through terrain where every step was difficult, with loose rocks making footing treacherous, and with the steepness of the slopes requiring use of hands as well as feet to climb in some locations. The weight of his equipment made the climb exhausting, with Nowak being forced to stop frequently to catch his breath, despite understanding that stopping made him a better target for German fire. The soldier ahead of Nowak was hit by German machine gun fire, approximately 100 yards from their starting position, falling backward down the slope and rolling several yards before his body came to rest against a rock outcropping. Nowak continued climbing, understanding that stopping to help the wounded man would not save him and would increase the likelihood of Nowak himself being hit. The German machine gun fire that swept the slopes was coming from multiple positions, making it impossible to take cover from one position without being exposed to fire from another. Nowak dropped to the ground when he saw tracers passing overhead, pressing himself against the rocky slope and attempting to identify where the fire was coming from so he could move toward cover when the fire shifted. The rocks around him were struck by German bullets, creating sparks and sending rock fragments flying that could cause injuries even when bullets didn't hit directly. The sounds of battle were overwhelming, with machine gun fire, rifle fire, artillery explosions, and the screams of wounded men creating a cacophony that made thinking difficult and that created constant fear that competed with training and discipline. The fighting on May 12-14 continued the pattern of Polish attacks gaining ground during daylight and losing some positions during nighttime German counterattacks, with casualties mounting on both sides as the battle became an attritional struggle for control of individual positions and individual sections of the mountain. The German paratroopers defending Cassino were running low on ammunition and supplies by May 14th, with resupply becoming increasingly difficult as French forces advancing through the mountains threatened German supply routes and as Allied air attacks destroyed German supply convoys attempting to reach forward positions along roads that were being observed by Allied aircraft during daylight hours. General Heydrich, commanding the 1st Parachute Division, recognized by May 16th that his division's position was becoming untenable, with French forces having penetrated so far through the mountains that Highway 82 in the German rear was threatened, with Polish forces on Monte Cassino having advanced to positions from which they could potentially capture the monastery if they received reinforcements, and with ammunition stocks being depleted to levels where continued defense would become impossible within days. Heydrich requested permission from higher headquarters to withdraw from Cassino, while withdrawal routes remained open, arguing that attempting to hold positions until the division was completely surrounded and destroyed would serve no purpose except to sacrifice his paratroopers without affecting the overall campaign's outcome. The authorization to withdraw from Cassino was granted on May 17th by General Senger, after he confirmed that French advances had created a situation where the Gustav line was being outflanked and where continuing to defend forward positions would result in German forces being trapped when Allied forces advancing through the mountains reached the German rear areas. The withdrawal orders directed the 1st Parachute Division to evacuate positions on Monte Cassino during the night of May 17-18th. While leaving small rear guards to delay Polish forces and to cover the withdrawal, with the main body of the division withdrawing to new positions approximately 10 miles to the north, where they would join other German forces, establishing a new defensive line. The German withdrawal from Cassino was conducted skillfully, with units moving back through prepared routes while engineers destroyed positions and created obstacles that would slow Polish pursuit. The German rearguards left in positions on Monte Cassino numbered approximately 200 paratroopers who were ordered to hold until morning of May 18th and then to withdraw or surrender depending on circumstances, with the mission being to prevent Polish forces from realizing immediately that main German forces had withdrawn and to delay Polish occupation of the monastery until the withdrawal was complete. The Polish forces advancing during May 17th-18th encountered reduced German resistance and realized that Germans were abandoning positions that had been held so tenaciously during previous days, leading to accelerated Polish advances that reached the monastery ruins on the morning of May 18th. Lieutenant Masłowski and his platoon from the 12th Podolski Lancers Regiment were among the first Polish troops to reach the monastery, finding the buildings abandoned except for German wounded who had been left behind because they could not be evacuated and who surrendered to the Poles without resistance. The Polish flag raised over the monastery ruins at approximately 09:45 hours on May 18th was a white and red banner that had been carried through the entire campaign, specifically for this moment, with the flag raising being photographed by Polish combat photographers who had accompanied the assault forces. The photographs would become iconic images in Polish history, appearing in textbooks and in museums, and being reproduced countless times in books and articles about the Italian campaign and about Polish contributions to Allied victory. The soldiers raising the flag understood the symbolic significance of the moment, that they were claiming victory on behalf of Poland in a battle where Polish forces had succeeded where others had failed, and that the images being captured would serve as proof of Polish military capabilities. The capture of Monte Cassino on May 18th did not end the battle for the Gustav line, with fighting continuing along other sections of the line as German forces conducted fighting withdrawals, attempting to delay Allied advances while avoiding encirclement. The German forces defending the Gustav line had suffered approximately 20,000 casualties during the May battles, losses that represented approximately 25% of the defending force, and that included many of the best-trained troops, including paratroopers whose training and experience could not be quickly replaced. The Allied casualties during Operation Diadem totaled approximately 42,000, killed, wounded, and missing distributed among American, British, French, Polish, Indian, Canadian, and other forces, with Polish forces at Cassino suffering approximately 4,000 casualties, including 924 killed during the week of fighting that captured the monastery. The Polish military cemetery at Monte Cassino was established immediately after the battle on slopes below the monastery where Polish soldiers had fought during May 1944, with the first graves being dug by Polish soldiers burying their comrades who had been killed during the assault. The cemetery was expanded after the war to include Polish soldiers who died in other Italian campaigns and who were reinterred at Cassino, creating a memorial that contains graves of 172 Polish soldiers. The cemetery's design includes a memorial wall listing names of Polish soldiers who died in Italy, but whose remains were never found or identified, and a monument featuring Polish military symbols, including the Polish eagle and the badges of units that fought at Cassino. The 4 battles of Monte Cassino from January through May 1944 cost Allied forces approximately 55,000 casualties and demonstrated the extreme difficulty of attacking well-prepared defensive positions in mountainous terrain, even when attackers possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers, in firepower, and in air support. The German casualties during the same period totaled approximately 20,000, a ratio of nearly 3 Allied casualties for each German casualty that reflected the enormous advantages defenders enjoyed in terrain that allowed them to observe attackers advancing across open ground while being protected in bunkers and positions that could withstand all but direct hits from heavy weapons. The monastery of Monte Cassino, destroyed and rebuilt, stands today as memorial to the soldiers of many nations who fought and died in the mountains of central Italy during 1944, and as reminder of what the liberation of Europe cost in lives and suffering.